So welcome everybody to this fifth session of what we've called the virtual series of our global conference on biodiversity finance that we are organizing between OECD Blue Team and UNDP Biofin. We are really happy that we were able to organize this meeting despite all the challenges out there, and we hope that you're all safe and sound on a personal level. This session is going to be in particular about the private and financial sector. We have already in the first 4 sessions talked a lot about what's the global state of biodiversity finance, what's the public sector doing, how can we deal with subsidies that have a negative impact, and how can we create finance plans to reduce our financial needs. Now it's time to hear directly from the private sector, and within that the financial sector, to get their perspective. We gonna have the following structure for this session. We'll start with an opening statement by Norad, and after that we're going to have a brief overview presentation that I'll give to highlight what are the sort of main concepts out there on engaging with the private and financial sector. And after that we have a brief poll in which you can participate, and I hope you will. And then we're gonna start with our panel discussion, and we have 5 very interesting panelists ready for you. And we'll have then a brief Q&A session, and you'll be able to write your questions in the chat box for that. And after that, we hope to have some time to hear from you directly as well. So participants will be welcome to contribute on their experience on the financial and private sector. And then we'll briefly reflect on what has been mentioned. And after that, we close. So the whole session should take around 1.5 hours, and hopefully we can stick to this time. So let's get going, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome here Mr. Bart Vegar Soljel from NORAD. As you may know, NORAD is an important global stakeholder in biodiversity finance, and also working with the private sector and the financial sector and supporting countries with various funds. Also, they're contributing to Biofin, and of course, they've been a major supporter with RED mechanisms. So I think without further ado, Mr. Bart Vegar, over to you to address this meeting.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you also from my home office here in Norway. Researchers estimate that there were around 16 million trees on Easter Island when a group of Polynesians first came there around the year 1200. The island is tiny, so it must have been incredibly green. And when Captain James Cook, the British adventurer and sailor, came there in March 1774, there were no trees left. They were all cut down. And without trees, there's 10 to 15,000 inhabitants couldn't build boats. Without boats, no fisheries. Without fisheries, no living. And without trees and tree cover, the soil was naked, and the elements destroyed the soil, the wind, the rain, the sun. And it became almost impossible to grow something there. So the society actually collapsed in famine, with hunger, and it became a society failing. It's the American biologist Jared Diamond who tells this story in his book Collapse, and it is not unique. And in a very different but more spectacular way, so to speak, we experience the same now with the COVID-19 outbreak. It illustrates the fragile links between people, planet, and the economy. Nature is not an externality to growth and development. Nature is the foundation of growth and development around the world. We rely on nature for almost everything: food, clothes, medicines, water, pollination, a stable climate, and so on. And the private sector relies on nature. Thus, it is only natural that our industries and businesses play an important role in mobilizing the resources that are needed. Norway's International Climate and Forest Initiative, NICFI, is the main biodiversity program in Norwegian development cooperation. It started with the aim to create a viable carbon market and as part of RED Plus financing, like was mentioned. But as the program matured, the biodiversity component has become more important, as has the role of finance and private sector mobilization. We are losing tropical forests at an alarming rate. They're eaten up by expanding production of globally traded commodities such as soy, cattle, palm oil, wood products, and so on. Many producers already see long-term benefits of a more sustainable business model. But to realize these opportunities, there's a need for financial backing that allows them to take the risks of demonstrating business models that are both environmentally and socially and financially sound. I would like to use the example of the And Green Fund as a tool to leverage private capital to co-finance large-scale investments in deforestation-free agriculture production. And Green provides a moderate share, around 1/5 of a project investment, and pull much more private capital into projects. To move massive commercial investments into sustainable production, we need to match more of these private investments with concessional capital until we reach the point where sustainability becomes the new mainstream. This involves short-term risks for sure, but it is even more risky not to try. In order to ensure finance at scale, countries that successfully reduce deforestation must be recognized and get access to finance. And companies need to be able to buy carbon credits with high quality and integrity. Norway has thus supported the establishment of a new trading platform called Emergent. A number of countries and global companies have supported the idea of a global trading platform facilitating high quality carbon transactions. We will guarantee a globally attractive minimum price for a substantial amount of credits through Emergent, with a new view to leverage much larger funds from the private sector and to kickstart a global carbon high integrity market. Norway have been engaged, like so many of you, in biodiversity finance since the HC targets were negotiated in 2010. We worked a lot with it towards the Hyderabad meeting, where I was attending myself in 2012. We also value Biofin as a successful technical assistant to countries to mobilize resources from their own national budget, as well as the private and financial sector. And two recent evaluations from JEF and UNDP has documented excellent results. COVID-19 and what lies beyond that is a huge challenge, and it's closely connected to the biodiversity challenge that we face together. But we also know from history, and modern history has taught us, that we humans have the ability to solve problems we created ourselves. World wars, famine, totalitarian ideologies, natural disasters, or pandemics. And we also have the ability to deal with the huge challenges of climate change and biodiversity. At our best, cooperation and understanding the challenge we are in is the best facet of humans, and we need it more now more than ever from the public sector and also from the private sector. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussions following now.
Thank you so much for that, and that was very inspiring, and it's a great mirror for us to keep in mind that we don't want to end up like Easter Island. It's a great comparison, and we really appreciate also as Biofin the support we have received over the years from NORAD to carry out this financing work in countries. So thank you so much for that. I would now like to move over to a very brief overview presentation of some of the main concepts that are out there, some of the main actors that we have in the private sector, and also looking at some global numbers. And that's what we're going to start with. So here you can see some figures from an OECD report that's called A Comprehensive Overview of Global Biodiversity Finance. If you want to read more, you can join our LinkedIn group to find it. And as you can see here, the contribution from the private sector is around 6.6 to 13.6 billion dollars per year, which at the first glance doesn't look very high compared to what the public sector does. But we just have to keep in mind that it's a very significant amount. And as well, this is still probably a very conservative estimate, because private sector doesn't really keep track of what they're spending, what they're doing on biodiversity. And organizations like OECD and UNDP BIFIN are working with companies to make measurements and with governments to track this kind of expenditures, but there's a long way to go. So in reality, we hope that this number is already much higher than this. And what are some of those expenditures that fall under this category? Well, you can think of things like biodiversity offsets, payment for ecosystem services, and investments towards certification in the forestry sector. Now, so we have some idea of the global state. Now let's look next at what are some of the main concepts that make the private sector and finance sector engage. What is the business case for biodiversity action? First of all, I'm going to look at a few different elements of this engagement. So first of all, the private sector is very strongly dependent on biodiversity for their productions, in particular in sectors like agriculture. The annual market value of animal pollinated crops is between 235 and 577 billion dollars per year, a very high number. And also coral reefs are estimated to generate around 36 billion per year for tourism. So a lot of economic sectors are highly dependent on nature. But there's also the other side of the coin. There are impacts on nature, and often negative. Around 1/3 of our global fish stocks are still fished in an unsustainable way. And we also know that, for example, the fashion industry is responsible for around 20% of the global wastewater. And again, I just want to refer to a report by the OECD published last year for the G7 ministers meetings called Finance and Economics Business Case for Action, where you can find a bit more content about this topic. Now next, there are some further dimensions of this engagement of the private sector. There are both risks for the private sector and financial sector, as well as opportunities. So what are some of those key risks out there? So some of the main risks include ecological risks. For example, due to the scarcity or poor quality of raw materials like fresh water, beverage companies can run out of their material they need for producing drinks. There are also liability risks. Just remember the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill that cost more than $65 billion. And there are also market risk. I think that's something on the mind of many companies. If you don't focus on green products and on biodiversity friendly products, you may lose market share. And that brings us actually to the next element, which is opportunities. Within all this, there are also strong opportunities for the private sector. And going back to the same issue of market share, we see actually that the market share of green products is growing rapidly. So there is a great opportunity now and in the future. There are also simply cost savings. If you do things more sustainably, you go digital, you have a lower footprint and lower costs at the same time. And of course, companies will be very sensitive for something like improved reputation and media coverage. Green companies are better reflected in the media and in the international perception of consumers. Right, so just going a little bit more into detail on what those investments look like, we can now look at the two sides of the coin that I already referred to. And I hope you appreciate the nice biodiversity coins that we already found from around the world. So again, when we're dealing with the private and financial sector, we have to keep in mind those two sides of the coin. What are some of the mechanisms where we can attract more investment in biodiversity positive mechanisms? And a very familiar example is impact investment, and another one is green bonds. Those are some of the emerging mechanisms we have seen coming up in the last decade. But they're not that big for biodiversity as yet, but they're growing, and we have to help scaling them up and doing a better job. Then on the other side of the coin, we know that there are a lot of negative impacts from many different economic sectors. And there are actually a lot of options out there to check investment portfolios and frameworks to see what those negative elements are and how we can keep them out. For example, you can do a negative screening where we check your portfolio to see if there are negative biodiversity impacts, and we can take them out of our investment portfolio, or we can actually reward first movers and do a kind of best-in-class screening. Now, there are a lot of other different products out there, and I will not go more into detail here, but I think these are the two axes that we can keep in mind that we always need to focus on when we deal with the private and financial sector. Then also, let's have a closer look at what those investments really are currently. So here's an overview of some of the main investment categories in biodiversity positive sectors. And if you see there, the first item mentioned is sustainable agriculture, forestry, and fishery products, and in particular forestry products. All this combined already received investments of more than 400 billion. So this is very promising news. Also, ecotourism is a very big recipient of investments currently. And there are also things like carbon credits and compensation schemes and subsidies that have very significant amounts of investments. Now I would like to next talk a bit more about what BIFIN is doing, and I just want to first highlight this brand new publication that we call Moving Mountains, just to reflect that it's not an easy job to get the private sector on board for conservation, but it's a job we must take on. And here are some examples of the work that we do in countries. And so if you have a look at this list, then you can see that every country is doing quite a different type of activity. So this is really the philosophy of BIFIN, to have this bottom-up approach and look at ideas that are homegrown, that come from the countries. And then you end up with a quite big mix of portfolio of financing solutions. So I'm just going to highlight two of them here. First of all, in Chile, we work on green production of public and private partnerships. And what we're doing is they have already a cleaner production mechanism, which has very well integrated all the climate considerations. So we help them to also look closer at biodiversity. And this has been now integrated to an amendment of their guidelines and operations. And they already received the first biodiversity positive investments through the mechanism. Another one I want to highlight here is Zambia, where we work on green bonds. So green bonds is an example where green is not always dark green. A lot of the green bonds are about energy, and we have to work harder to bring biodiversity in. And that's exactly what they're doing in Zambia. They work on a green bond framework that has a very strong biodiversity component. And we really want to congratulate Zambia because earlier in this year, they formally adopted this green bond framework. And we're now supporting feasibility work to look at the first bond they want to create under this framework. Now let's move over to the last part, where I want to just highlight very briefly who is part of this group of actors that are important in the finance and private sector, because we all talk a lot about private sector and finance sector, but we really need to impact this. So this is what we call the universe of actors. And as you can see, there are a lot of different important players. There are central banks that can play a role at the policy level. There are, of course, commercial banks, private enterprises, insurers, payment platforms, asset managers, and pension funds, and also development bond banks are an important actor. So these are sort of the emerging stars on the horizon that we see with the increased engagement of the private sector. And what we're going to do next in this session is talk to some of those stars. So we're going to have our 5 panelists that represent different stars from this group, and we're going to hear a bit more from their experiences. But before we're doing that, we first want to hear from you. We first would like to do a very brief poll and have a look when it comes up. We have 2 questions for you. Right, so there are 2 questions, and you can already start filling it in. So the first question is, what do you think is the main driver for the private sector to support biodiversity? Are those ecological risks we mentioned? Is it regulatory? Is it financial? Is it business opportunities? So which risks or opportunities do you really think are the ones that bring the private and financial sector on board here? And the second one is about central banks. Central banks can play a very active role in biodiversity finance. So tell us more about your country. Does your country's central bank take into account biodiversity and ecosystems? Does it talk about that? Not yet, or maybe it's doing that very comprehensively. We hope they do. So let's hear from all of you, and we have actually 2 minutes to fill this panel, but please try to do it as soon as possible. Right, I see a lot of people are filling it, so we have almost 100 answers, so we're going to keep going a little bit, and on the 2-minute mark, which is in 30 seconds, we'll close it off and then share the results. And also, by the way, I'm glad to see we have well over 200 participants already online, so great to have you all here, and we hope to hear from you in our polls and in our chat box and with questions for our panelists later on. Right, so the time's up for our panel. We have almost 130 answers. So let's have a quick look at the what you think are the main reasons for the private sector to embrace investments in conservation. So regulatory risk is actually picked as a #1 choice, and also reputational and market risks. So look at this regulatory risk, governments around the world. This is really an important issue to address. And then on our second question, on the central bank, so let's see, so in 6 countries at least, the central bank is in a quite comprehensive way looking at biodiversity and ecosystem services, and in another 47 somewhat. And we also have a lot of people, they're not sure if their bank is doing that. So perhaps that's something you can do in the future, is knock on their door and say, hey, we heard that central banks are an important biodiversity stakeholder. What are you doing? And hopefully it's something that more and more central banks are going to focus on in the future. So that was our poll, and some really interesting results. And now we're going to actually move to the main part of this meeting, which is our panel discussion. And I already mentioned we have 5 panelists with us today, and they're representing the private and financial sector from very different angles. And let me just briefly introduce the panel members. First of all, we are glad to have the CEO of Mirova, Mr. Philippe Zawati, who's with us today. Welcome. We're going to go to you soon with our questions. Second, we have from Sri Lanka, the Additional Director for Domestic Operations of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, who's going to be the second speaker. And then we're going to hear from Gilles Kleitz, Director of Natural Resources, Agriculture, Water, Forest, and Oceans at the AFD. After that, we move to Ms. Mabel Niala, who's the Public Relations and Communications Strategy, Corporate Affairs from the CEO Office of GCash in the Philippines. Thanks for joining us there. And finally, we're going to listen to what Danone is doing to have a positive impact on biodiversity from Alice Durand-Reville. She's the Corporate Public Affairs Director of Danone. So we have 2 specific questions for each panelist, and then we're going to do a second round with some general questions. So we're going to start, as I mentioned, with Mirova. And just one note again, if you have questions for any of the panelists, go to the chat box and write them there. We're going to try to have them responded, and we pick one of them to discuss in the plenary, but we also try to pick up any questions that remain and discuss them in our LinkedIn group. So we know that traditionally biodiversity hasn't been a major investment theme for the private sector, and natural resources have been considered more an input than an output. But in recent years, this has changed markedly. Mirova is an asset manager from France with sustainability as a specific objective. And Mrs. Zawati, can you tell us how we have seen investments into biodiversity evolving, looking at the past, present, and future? What do you see as the major trends?
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for organizing this meeting. I think it's very important to get the insight of the private sector as well. As you know, I mean, Mirova has been working on natural capital now for a couple of years. We started 4 years ago with a very interesting project. I mean, which was built with the UNCCD, EIB, and AFD as well. Which was to gather money in order to invest in the rehabilitation of land in emerging countries. So this is a land degradation neutrality fund. But based on this, we have decided to build a bigger platform to invest in natural capital, not only land but also forest, agriculture, and also ocean. And today we have about $500 million invested in these assets, or to be invested in these assets. So I think what we have tried to do in the last years was really to be part of an ecosystem. I think it's very important to build an ecosystem on this and to strengthen it. This is the reason why we think that working with public-private partners, building some innovative tools, innovative financial tools, is something very important. What the trends that we have seen is that first, institutional investors are more and more interested in natural capital and want to be part of this story and want to invest more money in this. It's impact investing, but not only impact investing. There are a lot of really money, mainstream money, coming into this space. The second trend is that there are a lot of new projects, new entrepreneurs, new kind of businesses, which are really interesting. It's not only working with NGOs and traditional conservation finance, but it's more and more opportunities, more and more business models, new business models, which are coming into this space, and which need to be supported by the private sector. And then the third trend I would like to mention is clearly, of course, the partnerships between all the players on this, and especially private and public, and the innovative tools, the way that we try to use traditional finance tools like corporate finance and structured finance, project finance. And to use this tool into agriculture, into natural capital is something very interesting. But we need to do this strong partnership also with public players, and this is what we have seen growing the last couple of years. Even if it's not easy to do this, even if it's probably take too much time to implement this, but definitely this is clearly the way we see the space evolving in the coming years.
Thank you so much, and indeed it's a great perspective that we're all part of a global ecosystem, a natural one and a financial one, I would say. We're all connected. And you already mentioned this growing partnership. That sounds very promising. Can you tell us also about the other side of that? So what are some of the main challenges that you face in countries with your investments? And keep in mind that we have a lot of governments on the line here. Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I mean, challenges is that we need to really create a value chain. There are a lot of projects which are at the very beginning and not really investable. So what I can see is that what we need to do is really to create the value chain. Creating the value chain, that means different stages. So I would say 3 different stages. The first one is incubation. We need more incubation of small projects, starting businesses, which are not really investable for big institutional investors, but which need support. This is what we do in our technical assistance facility, for example, for the LDN fund with IDH in the Netherlands. But I think we need more. We need more incubation in order to grow these businesses and make it possible for the investors to come in a later stage. Then we have the second phase, which is basically what we do today with public-private partnerships layered funds and so on. That means using public money to de-risk project and then to bring some private money in it and grow the space. But then, after this stage, we will need also to really put all this at scale. And this will be, I think, the big challenge in the next few years. That means investing, as I said, €500 million in natural capital is good, but we need much more. And putting it at scale will mean probably, clearly develop some natural capital bonds and do what we have done in the carbon market with green bond. And I think this is probably one of the challenge moving forward.
Well, thank you so much for unpacking this reality for us to look at the different perspectives from incubation to scaling up. And it looks like we have to focus on all those. And we all, of course, hope that this scaling up is in fact going to happen. So thank you so much. I'm going to come back to you with another question later on. But first, I'm going to move from France to Sri Lanka and welcome again Dr. Anil Pereira from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So we have just heard from the private sector, but also we feel that the government, and Mr. Zawati already pointed at this, can actually do a lot to be a catalyzer and remove barriers or work on de-risking. So now we're going to hear a bit more about how Sri Lanka is approaching this because they've developed a green finance policy and adopted that last year. So Mr. Pereira, can you tell us a bit more about that green finance policy that you adopted last year? How can this policy bring in other stakeholders like public institutes and banks, and how can it actually benefit biodiversity?
Hi everyone, nice to see you on the virtual space, and we miss seeing you in person in Paris. By the way, we are having this meeting, and thank you for inviting me. And I hope Ramita is also from the Biofin of Sri Lanka is participating in this forum. So regarding the question, you're right, we launched a roadmap for sustainable finance last year. If I may give you a brief background on this, now Sri Lanka is a kind of a island, a small island, a beautiful island, sunny, very grainy, and surrounded by blue ocean. But as you know, Sri Lanka is facing some increasing environmental and climate challenges. Frequent natural disasters, deforestation, degradation of coastal and maritime resources, climate change, everything is common to Sri Lanka as well. And some people say this COVID-19 has brought some break to the environment, and you see blue sky, blue waters and everything because of the COVID. It's some kind of a positive side of the break. But we are facing some long-term challenges in terms of, we have estimated that we will be having 1 to 2% loss of annual GDP by 2050 if we go by this rate in terms of environmental degradation. And also by the Biofin, it has been highlighted or identified Sri Lanka as one of the biodiversity hotspots in the world. So we have estimated something like 200 million USD for next 7 years to finance these environmental related projects to protect the environment. So government has taken this thing very seriously. A few years back in 2015, Sri Lanka was one of the first countries in the world to appoint a parliamentary select committee on sustainability issues. So there was a committee called Sustainable Development Select Committee appointed by the president. And also Sri Lanka has passed legislation. We passed Sustainable Development Act in 2017 in order to implement these SDGs. And also it has become part of the government policies as well. So during 2018-19, the government basically aimed at their resources and fiscal issues, targeting the sustainability in the environment as well as in the economy. So in terms of central bank's initiative, the central bank joined the Sustainable Banking Network in 2016 actually, and thereafter in 2017 we launched a program to initiate a kind of a roadmap to introduce sustainable finance practices in Sri Lanka. So with the consultation of all the stakeholders in the financial system, and also broadly in line with the government's plan, we have set up a kind of a roadmap in 2019, and it has been introduced in the global arena in Washington with the Sustainable Finance and IFC annual meeting, World Bank annual meetings. We have launched this roadmap, and it was a collaborative effort, as I said, and it was financed actually by the Biofin initiative, UNDP, Sri Lanka. Ramita and his team basically supported us putting finances for this matter. So at the same time, while we were developing the roadmap as the central bank, the banking community, we have a banking association, they had been voluntarily practicing some of the principles. So they had some 11 principles. Before the central bank, actually, they took the initiative with some private links, and they are with some international counterparties. So they were actually ahead of us, ahead of the central bank. But once we introduced this roadmap, even these private sector and the banking sector, they also broadly aligned their policies with the central bank. Now, this the roadmap it involves some strategic activities, strategic priorities in terms of implementing sustainable finance in Sri Lanka. So we basically have 6 pillars in this roadmap. The first thing is a financing vision, basically introducing sustainable green products in the Sri Lankan financial markets. As we know, the sustainable bonds, sustainable liquidity, and sustainable green insurance products, and all these sustainability related things. And also the second thing, ESG, environmental, social and governance risk integration into the financial market. That is also one of the key areas of the roadmap. And then we have some key focus on financial inclusion, because Sri Lanka being one of the lower middle income country, we have a large segment of population who are basically into SMEs and very micro type businesses. So one of the concerns actually, in order to implement sustainability on a sustainable basis, we think this grassroots level has to be touched upon, especially in terms of providing necessary finance. So we have this priority in our roadmap, financial inclusion, and also capacity building international cooperation, and measurement and reporting. All these are very important aspects of the sustainable finance roadmap. We think if we are to achieve the goals set up on a short-term, medium-term, and a long-term basis in this roadmap, the national biodiversity diversified targets also will be achieved, and also will be able to avoid future expenses related to biodiversity restoration and risk management in the future. So those are the basic elements of the roadmap and the present status of the roadmap.
Right, thank you so much. From the BioFin perspective, we are very keen to continue to support your work, and it sounds like it's actually a very comprehensive reform process that you're undertaking, looking at so many different levels. And also it's clear from our poll that you're quite a pioneer in this. So can you just briefly tell our participants, what are your next steps? What are you going to focus on this year and perhaps next year?
Yes, right now we have set up a committee for the implementation, and it's actually an interregulatory committee. So the central bank being the apex institution regulating the banking sector and non-bank sector. And we also have some other regulators like Securities and Exchange Commission, and also we have the Insurance Regulatory Commission. With the support of all these regulators, we have an interregulatory committee in order to implement the targets and the tasks under the roadmap. So as I said, we have short-term, medium-term, and long-term targets set up under this roadmap. So for that matter, we have set up this implementation committee. And at the same time, we think we have to focus mainly on key aspects in relation to implementation. The first thing we think there should be a comprehensive and very clear taxonomy for us to implement the roadmap and sustainable finance practices. Because as we are aware, in different countries, especially in the emerging countries, the financial sectors are basically underdeveloped, and a lot of issues related to financial system you can identify. And country to country, these issues are different. So based on the country-specific issues, we are in the process of developing a taxonomy for Sri Lanka. That's the first step. And the second thing, in line with that, we are in the process of identifying key areas of regulation in terms of implementing sustainable finance. Because what we have seen, I think that's the case for many countries, the sustainability will become voluntary up to some extent. After that, it won't work, and we should have some framework in terms of regulation and monitoring within the financial sector. So we think we should have proper regulation, and that is also in place. The third aspect, the capacity building. So even though we have set up all these policies, taxonomy and all that, the actual practitioners in the market should have necessary skills and competencies. So we are in the process of developing a comprehensive capacity building program, again with the BioFin initiative. BioFin has supported us in terms of financing. So we are in the process of having a comprehensive training module this year and the next year for the financial sector players in order to have this sustainable finance roadmap in place.
Thank you. That's very exciting work on the taxonomy and on the capacity developing module. And I hope that in a future meeting, you could share your next lessons again.
Exactly.
Only a few countries are doing this. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
For that. Let us move ahead, and then we're going to stay in Asia. And I would like to now move to Ms. Mabel Niala, the Public Relations and Communication Strategy for Corporate Affairs of the CEO Office of GCash. So this is actually a quite different example of a payment platform working on something very innovative, combining incentives and generating revenue. So very exciting app that they've developed called GCash Forest. And Mabel, over to you now. So you developed this app called GCash Forest last year, and you found a very clever way to make people doing more sustainable things and also contributing to conservation. So please share your secret here and tell us how this app is working and what are the results that you've already seen.
First of all, good morning to everyone. Good afternoon where I am. Thank you for inviting Gcash over, and I'm really very proud to share with you what Gcash is doing to help the environment and of course, biodiversity as well. So Gcash is actually an app, as Anu has shared. It's an online app for payments, and we were inspired by our mother company, which is Ant Financial in China, where they actually have their ant forest, and they grew trees in the desert. And with that platform, we were inspired that we could actually have the Philippines have something like that to support the environment by changing lifestyles. That's why we came up with our own campaign under Gcash for Good, which is the overall social responsibility campaign of Gcash to help NGOs. And under that campaign is our support for the environment, which is, and we came up with this campaign for the forest, which is Gcash Forest. So what is Gcash Forest? Gcash Forest is actually a voluntary program that we have crafted for our users to be able to change lifestyles, as I've said, because through the use of the app, you don't go to the banks anymore. You don't use paper to have receipts, or you eliminate trash in that sense. So by using the app frequently, you actually generate points. You earn energy or carbon points, which eventually could grow, or this would actually grow your virtual trees on the app. So initially you'll have a virtual tree, and if you have enough carbon points to really grow it, then we will actually plant that virtual tree on your behalf at Ipo Dam in Bulacan, where it supports the 98% of the water supply of Metro Manila. So you have to earn at least 20,560 points over the app. And so you could have your own tree planted on your behalf, as I've said. And it would be helpful for biodiversity, because of course, if we grow our forests back, then we will be assured that biodiversity would definitely be supported, because there would be trees for the birds to stay in or use it as their homes. So the carbon reduced through the actions that our users do, as I said, is represented as a green energy. And with this collective effort, we have this plan of making everybody cashless in the Philippines, because we know that this will support the carbon footprint of the country. And to date, I'm happy to share with you that since we started the app in July 1st, 2019, we already have 2.8 million people having virtual trees on the platform. And the goal that we set for ourselves is just 365 trees in 365 days. So obviously, it has really grown exponentially, and we're so proud about what we do for the product, because right now, during this time of uncertainty, everybody else is really turning digital. As mentioned earlier, well, we really do not know, but I think digital is the way to go, the only way to go at this time, to make safer and convenient payment options. And Gcash is there to be able to help our users and invite more people to go digital, because as I've said, this will be the new norm, digital. So we're happy to share that all the 2.8 million users who have virtual trees are also encouraging their other friends to grow more trees, because you can invite friends over also. As I said, it's a campaign, and it's a gamified way of inviting people. especially the millennials, who's really our market, to make a difference. And this is how we want to be able to help the environment. And eventually, when we get to have other companies see what we do, then this is how we see how it's going to be funded. So we could plant more and more trees for the environment and have like-minded companies join us with this campaign, because ultimately it doesn't matter if you're in fintech or manufacturing or wherever it is. As long as we grow more trees for the environment, it would really make a difference. It's for the future generation to enjoy. So we're thinking, start it now, because we wouldn't know when everything else would end. So it would be nice to have millennials and all those who are in the app or technically savvy, or even not the technically savvy, to actually change their lifestyles and join us in this campaign.
Well, thank you so much, and indeed a great result to have so many people already sign up, and also good, of course, to realize that this is the kind of mechanism that in this current crisis can still go ahead and perhaps even grow, still bringing more money for conservation, even though tourism is down in the whole world and other funding streams are drying up as well. So congratulations, and it's great to see that concrete results are achieved in such a short time. I think this is a very encouraging sign for our participants that we must look at these innovative options, and they can pay off. They're not just experiments, but some of them can really be scaled up. So can you just tell us a little bit more about what's your next plan? Now you have a lot of people signed up. What are you planning to do next from here?
Okay. We plan to, of course, have more people go to the app, sign in, and grow more virtual trees. And eventually, as I've said, sign in more merchants, green merchants, as I would say, to also change the way they work towards this goal of planting more trees and being carbon neutral. And eventually also work with like-minded companies, as I've said, with the same goal of helping the environment, so we could get more funding to support this campaign. Currently, we're already tapping a lot of other companies already to get some funding, because right now we're funding it on our own. But I'm happy to share with you that there are already companies coming to us wanting to have this partnership. And so we're enjoying the partnership with them already by supporting like hectares of land found in, for example, set in Cebu, which is not actually part of our plan in Metro Manila. So we're trying to expand the campaign now to more islands of the Philippines, and that's really something that I'm very proud to share with this team. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Biofin, because Biofin has actually been very helpful in for us in choosing the right partners and choosing the right people to work with in supporting this campaign. And of course, we're working with the NGOs. Right now, it's WWF, which is our partner for planting the trees, because obviously GCash is it's not our forte, it's not our expertise to plant trees. So we tap those who are experts in this field, so we'll be able to achieve our goals and really grow and plant the trees that we need for the environment. Moving forward, I see the role of Biofin still helping us, because we know that through UNDP and Biofin, we will get more and more support and contacts who would be more interested to join us in this campaign, as I've said. So yeah, that's the plan. And we want to be able to add more features in the app to engage more our users.
Thank you for this very interesting result. And also great to hear you working with WWF to really bring kind of landscape conservation approach. We have seen so many other tree planting initiatives that are really about tree planting, but it's great that you have this conservation landscape angle. And wonderful to hear of this next steps, and likewise, we hope to hear more from you in the future. We keep following this, and as BioFin, of course, we'll continue to keep supporting this. And thanks for mentioning our great BioFin team in Philippines.
Of course, I'm always thankful. I'm always thankful and proud of the BioFin team because they've been very helpful to us. And yeah, the connections with DNR also helped us because without BioFin, I don't think we would be able to launch this initiative. And I'm forever thankful.
Thank you so much, Mabel. And sorry. And I think one of the trends that we see emerging from all these initiatives is actually partnerships, because these are all not standalone initiatives, but we see that actors are bringing in different partners. And also we can clearly see that payment platforms deserve to be a star in our universe. So it's well deserved, and we hope other countries will be inspired as well. So we're going now to the next star, and we're moving to France. Let's say rather different actor are development banks. And we know that development banks are trying to integrate biodiversity in different ways into their operations. And we now would like to move to Gilles Kleijs, the Director for Natural Resources, Agriculture, Water, Forests and Oceans at the AFD, the French Development Agency, with two questions. Gilles, can you tell us a bit more about what development banks can do? So what are some of the typical interventions development banks can undertake to reduce negative impacts on biodiversity from their investments?
Thank you, Ono, and thank you to UNDP and the BioFin and OECD for organizing this very interesting conference in such difficult conditions. Public development banks invest about 10% of the global investment that is made around the world. That is about 2 trillion if you account for all public development banks, whether they work at national, regional, or global level. Their specificity is that they are under vertical political control by a government or a state, which is usually their main or single shareholder, which means that they are very well equipped to be politically aligned to SDGs, to climate agreements, to biodiversity, to fight against desertification, etc., much more than the private finance sector. So in particular, they can show very strong political signs in terms of what it means to take care of biodiversity. The main basic things that that development banks do to avoid negative impact on biodiversity is obviously safeguards and exclusion lists. That's the first principle, basic principle that is worth reminding everyone. So for example, development banks can decide not to finance anything that contributes to deforestation. They can decide to exclude any projects, financing any project that have negative impacts on critical habitats, and follow some standards, some standard procedures that have been established long back, but that are still not necessarily observed by all public finance institutions around the world. So there's a lot of progress as well that can be done. Beyond the exclusion list, they can as well have very strong safeguard and points of attention with specific areas such as the ocean, such as forests, such as wetlands, and ensure that even if these areas are not critical habitats, that everything is made to ensure that they are sustainably used. They can obviously make sure that they have very strict offsetting standards, i.e. that every possible impacts in transport or in all the impacting sectors that they have to finance, that a strict offsetting policy is implemented. They have to make sure that all these requirements are included in their financial contracts, i.e. that when they finance a state or a minister or a private entity, that including in their financial contract all these safeguards are inscribed in the contracts, observed, and the object of specific management plans for environmental and social activity. They as well have to be exemplary in following up on these commitments, and this means strong ex post evaluation of impacts. That is, I think, one very clear avenue for action and for progress as well. Another interesting aspect of public finance institution and public development banks especially is their convening power. So they can actually bring together a public finance, a private finance, a beneficiary, whether it's a ministry or so on in the south, but as well science, NGOs, a very strong expertise to make sure that the overall biodiversity quality of the project is really up to the best possible standard. One of the key things that we are working on in development banks is the own capacity of development banks in terms of expertise, because we think that dialogue with our counterparts or partners that we finance is absolutely key, and having a strong biodiversity dialogue with the ministries of finance that we work with, for example, that is a very strong contribution to avoid any negative impacts of our activity on biodiversity. A last point that is important is to answer your question, Ono, is to remind as well everyone that the sector, the public finance sector, I mean, provides beyond avoiding negative impact, provides positive finance to biodiversity. And I think, for example, the French Development Agency provides about $500 million of biodiversity co-benefits directly in supporting conservation, but as well in financing mainstreamed economic activities such as organic farming, etc. So as you see, these methods of avoiding impacts through exclusion lists, safeguards, etc., the positive impacts, the convening power, all these are very important avenues that public development institutions can mobilize to avoid negative impacts. Strengthening positive finance is key. And in both these areas, I think there is still a lot of progress that can be made altogether.
Thank you for that very interesting answer. I think all of us need to get to know development banks a bit better and what they do for biodiversity. So this was a good start. And especially those co-benefits are very significant. So it's really good to know about that as well. You also already pointed at the fact that not every bank yet is integrating biodiversity in a similar way. And so my second question is about this. You're also working on some kind of network between the different development banks out there to do this. Please tell us a little bit more about this network. How does it work and what are you doing?
Sure. There are about 400 to 500 development banks in the world. Again, if you look at their investment per year, 2 trillion, in that you have about 150 billion that are ODA, that float around the world to finance especially developing countries. And among that, you have, as OECD and others have established, anywhere between 4 to 9 billion that is biodiversity positive finance. But basically, all these safeguards and all these methods that I told you about are still not necessarily implemented thoroughly everywhere. So we've decided that at least among bilateral development banks, which constitute about 2/3 of this 6 to 9 billion of positive ODA finance for biodiversity. We've decided that among a club of about 30 banks, mostly from the global south, like DBSA in South Africa, like BNDSA in Brazil, like China Development Bank, us, KfW, we've decided to create a club that's called IDFC, the International Development Finance Club. And we started working 4 years ago on climate finance, trying to map, identify, qualify, and improve climate finance to reach 100 billion altogether of our activity that is climate proof and climate positive. And about a year and a half ago, we initiated a similar work on biodiversity. So the idea is really to benchmark on what all of the 30 members of IDFC are doing in terms of safeguards, in terms of exclusion lists, in terms of mapping or biodiversity finance, mostly using the OECD CAD and Rio markers framework, trying to better qualify and quantify our efforts. So the idea is not necessarily to propose standard methods and hope that one day we'll have one common frame, both for risk management, mapping, taxonomy for positive projects, but at least to share experiences, learn from each other, and obviously encourage best practices. All this work, whether it's about describing how we work, a benchmark, and better qualifying our activities, is going to be presented in the coming international biodiversity events, which were to take place in 2020, but which are now delayed. So we'll probably have a number of side events to present all that much more in detail. At SBI this summer in Montreal, hopefully, or virtually, and as well at the World Conservation Congress in IUCN, and obviously at the COP15 early 2020. And just to let everybody know, development banks are going to meet for the first time, probably virtually, we don't know yet, but at least in November in the Paris Peace Forum. There'll be the first ever gathering of all public development banks around the world, with this idea that they are an incredible lever, political lever to align finance and general efforts on SDGs, on climate, and on biodiversity. And at this summit, at least this global gathering, will present as well some of our efforts to streamline and mainstream biodiversity in development bank and their finance activities.
Thank you so much for that. And indeed, you have a very big finance flow in your hands that hopefully we can green more, and very encouraging to hear of this emerging partnership. I think many people not so much aware. So I hope you can all keep us informed, and we look forward to hear more in future meetings that you already mentioned. So now we are going to move to another representative of the private sector. Very appropriately, as our sort of dessert of this panel, we're going to talk to Danone. And of course, as one of the biggest food companies in the world, they are working on very major value chains that cross perhaps all of the continents. And we know that Danone is working on both biodiversity positive investments and reducing the negative ones. So Alice, I'm going to talk to Alice Durand-Reville, the Corporate Public Affairs Director of Danone. Alice, can you give us some examples of what the agriculture sector, you as Danone, can do to transition to sustainable production?
Of course. Well, thank you very much, Ono, and thank you very much to OECD and UNDP to give us the floor in order to share our experience. So I'm Alice Durand-Reville, and I'm very honored to speak here on behalf of Danone as the International Relation and Multi-Stakeholder Partnerships Director. As you mentioned, Ono, Danone is a food company that has been in the dairy and the food sector for more than 100 years. We are serving 800 million consumers in more than 120 countries. Danone has this specificity to be what we call a purpose-led company, which means that we have set ourselves a mission, which is really driving our activities beyond profit. This mission is embedded in our logo, which is One Planet, One Health, that is expressing our very deep-rooted conviction that the health of the people and the health of the planet are really interconnected, and you cannot, on the long run, serve the one without serving the others. As a food company, as you already mentioned during the meeting, we are critically dependent on biodiversity. But our statement is now very clear that our food system is broken, that the food system alone is responsible for around 60% of global biodiversity loss. And this loss is fueled by an increasing over-specialized system, monoculture, and intensive farming practices. And there's one conviction we have, is that we won't be able to feed more than 9 billion persons worldwide if we go on this destructive course. But if I've got a message here, is that as much agriculture can be part of the problem, and I'm not only talking about small scale agriculture, I'm talking about big scale agriculture, it is also part of the solution. Indeed, what we have seen in the current COVID crisis is that the planet has a very powerful potential to regenerate itself. And agriculture can really nudge and nurture this process by adopting new practices, what we call regenerative agriculture practices. Those practices have in common to use the power of plants, so natural power, in order to regenerate soil, retain water, and improve globally the farmers' incomes and their livelihoods. So now, of course, I'm going to move to concrete examples, because that's what you asked for, and that is really helping to understand how it works. So I'm going to focus on two examples. The first one is an example of Madre Tierra, which is an example in Mexico. So from a very business perspective, Mexico is the provider of 50% of the strawberries for the American markets. The American markets has requirements, very, very strict requirements in terms of traceability, quality, sustainability, and so on and so forth. In the other end, the Mexican farmers, strawberry farmers, are really often stuck in vicious circle of poverty with lack of technical knowledge, unsustainable farming practices, low productivity, and a lot of informal intermediaries that cut them away from the market and add a lot of uncertainty and cost to their production. Danone and many stakeholders, and I would like to really stress what Gilles mentioned previously, which is we really need convening powers. And in this case, precisely, it's GIS, the German agency, that really helped us. So we set up a project with a lot of local stakeholders, so NGOs, local authorities, these development agencies, in order to really regenerate the whole supply chain in order to make it stronger. Concretely, the project is providing 700 Mexican producers with financial, technical, and technological resources, and training them in respectful agriculture practices, including sustainable soil and water management, and also sustainable fertilization methods. So, in fact, linking the retailers, the producers, and the markets with this regenerative agriculture methods methods that are meeting the requirements of the big industry, we really managed to transform the value chain of strawberry productions in Mexico, going all the way from the small farmers to the industry and to the consumers. It brings value. Globally, it brought 30% higher income to the producers, better stability, better visibility, but also for Danone, the interest is that we have been able to provide very strong traceability to our consumers, and also guarantee the sustainability of the practices. So this model has been going on in Mexico, and we found it so interesting that we are now developing it in Morocco, which is one of the biggest provider of strawberry for Europe. In the same kind of pattern, we have many projects that are always multi-stakeholders and always locally fitted. So I'm gonna talk to you about a second project that we have in Africa, in Mount Elgon in Kenya. We find globally the same pattern here, which is a need for a precise supply. This is with livelihood fund, with a private fund, with many companies. So the need for a supply, which was milk, and the commitment of companies to buy for a long period this supply, which is milk. The second big pattern is that you need a deep change of the practices in order to improve the livelihood of the farmers and to break with the circle of poverty. So you need to introduce agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, diversified crops, tree plantings, and a lot of those methods and practices that really are improving on the long term the livelihood of the farmers, because you have diversity in nutrition, but also they're decreasing their dependency to outside entrants like fertilizers or pesticides. And it takes a long transformation pathway. This project is due for 10 years. And it takes also a lot of different stakeholders coming in and working with us, for sure the farmers, for sure local NGOs, for sure local authorities, and finance support. At the end of the pathway, we really have a new model, which is totally self-sustainable and bring a better income and resilience to the farmers. So on this case, we are talking about 40,000 smallholder farmers in Kenya, and an increase of income that will go for 30 to 70%. So I quoted those two examples, but I would have just two little sentences in conclusion. The first one is that now the real challenge is not to have pilots, because the whole food industry has pilots. But the real question is, how are we going to scale it up in a very important and massive way in order to meet the climate and the biodiversity challenge that we are facing? Just as a reminder, we food company and food systems have only 10 years left to bend the curve. If we don't succeed to really drastically change our ways of working and our ways of producing, in 10 years, it's very doubtful that we can still have healthy, sustainable supply chains and value chains for agriculture. So scaling up is the real challenge. And then the second is, and it's linked to the first, we have to go together. We have to work together. We have to break the silos. And I was very happy to hear from example in Sri Lanka and from others that are really breaking the silo as we are. And this is also why Danone launched last year in the UN, during the UNGA, an initiative that is a business coalition, which is named One Planet Business for Biodiversity. It's OP2B. It's gathering 21 companies, which are mainly in the food sectors, big companies like Nestle, Mars, Unilever, but so on and so forth. to work together in order to use their own value chains in order to bring this transition at scale to regenerative agriculture. And so we're really working in a very open way, in a very action-oriented way too. And we convene everyone who is interested to join us and to contact us. And I will provide in the comments the link to the general manager of OP2B. So our real point now is to scale up. Thank you, Ono.
Thank you so much for that. And scaling up, that seems to be also something we've heard before. And also a question that you've heard before is, we have a lot of governments here on the line. They're all listening to you. And what do you have to tell them? What can governments do to get more of this biodiversity positive investments?
Well, thank you very much. It's always tricky for private sector to tell governments what they could do or should do. So just take it as from the ground and from the field requests and maybe more as considerations. First of all, what business need is really a level playing field. We need we need governments to really redirect some subsidies, a level playing field that will encourage the uptake of these regenerative agricultural practices. We cannot do it alone for sure. And so governments have a very big part to play. The first of all is, and you have been working on it for the last meetings, which is really thinking about subsidies and also a lot of others methods that can be lower taxes, public procurement or things like that. But of course we need to have encouraging subsidies for farmers to encourage this transition, but exactly at the same time have stronger regulations that are enforced regulations that will penalize or discourage some very short-term practices like is overuse of certain types of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and also very strongly punish and discourage deforestation. Because as long as this very clear framework is not set, it's quite difficult for us to go and have this clicker effect that we are looking for. The second, Sri Lanka has pointed it out with a very really rightfully, which is capacity and innovation, capacity building and innovation, and investing in capacity building. The specificity of agriculture is that everything happens on the field. Everything happens and starts with farmers, and in regenerative agriculture, every innovation is really done on farms with farmers. So it's really important to have a gathering of investments in order to help farmers and support innovation really at ground level. For example, in Danone North America, we have partnered with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation in an innovative multi-year public-private partnership in order to really have a lever effect between public and private funding. And this enabled us to really grow at scale our pilots and help farmers and benefit from their knowledge in order to have a very significant progress in science and in the uptake of the practices for more than 100,000 acres in the US, which is very, very important, and it's quite good. So this is for us something that is really inspiring, how we can join with government in order to end local training partners in order to really train the farmers and go at scale. And then the third point I would like to stress is really that governments has always and also an important part to play in actively support the shift to more biodiversity and sustainable system from the society point of view. Just, I think we are all aligned here to know that it's going to be critical for the society and for all of us to stop using food and seeing food as a commodity, but seeing also food as a whole ecosystem with systemic impact. And it's going to be very important that the society understands that we have to pay not only for the food, but also for nature and ecosystemic services. So in this message of making everybody understand how precious is the nature and how precious is food, not only for the nutrition intake, but also for the whole ecosystemic service that it renders. For sure, this is also a play where government must play. And for instance, they can really increase transparency in setting very clear rules like labels, like public procurement, like also regulations that will help transparency on those new products that are issued from regenerative agriculture. Just as a conclusion, it's true that this has very well worked in Western country, mostly for organic purchases, but organic is not going to be able to feed the world. So we need also to invest in more intermediate ways of producing that are sustainable for everyone and affordable for everyone. And this is regenerative agriculture. Thanks.
I think it is such a fascinating story, and thanks for bringing us to the perspective of local communities. So I think a lot of the financing work that we're doing need to be rooted in what local communities are doing, and they are often the guardians of the natural resources that we want to preserve for our planet. So thank you so much for this intervention, and we have actually come to the end of our main panel discussion. And I want to thank all the panelists for already answering a lot of questions in the chat box. It has been very, very efficient. So great job there. And I hope people are enriched. But there's still a few questions that are pending, and I wasn't able to follow that myself. So I'm just going to pass over to my colleague Marco, who has been very closely monitoring that. And then Marco, over to you to share some of the main questions that haven't been picked up yet, and I hope you can all bear with us to stay on a little longer for that.
Thank you so much, Ono. So yeah, maybe to keep on the subject, so to have a good continuity, Thailand is actually asking a question to Alice. So with the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic, they're wondering how Danone and other big companies could provide support to smallholder farmers to ensure the value chain development will not collapse.
Well, thank you. You want to have other questions, or I can
no, please feel free to answer. And
so very soon Danone has taken some steps. We have issued a very important fund in order to maintain the turnover of our main providers, but also going up to the smallest of our providers. So for the moment, we reacted very swiftly, and we started first by ensuring all our providers and all our suppliers that we would maintain at least 3 months payments or for a full, and then we have also unlocked a special and set up and unlocked a special funds for all the very small older farmers that we are in contact and in order to maintain their activity. But really this crisis is a super important wake-up call for all of us, that we have really to change our ways of working and work and invest in resilience. And resilience comes with regenerative agriculture.
Thanks a lot, Alice. So now moving on to actually Dr. Pereira from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So some of the participants were wondering, so it was really clear what you did from Sri Lanka, and so they were wondering how could they approach their central bank in their country to convince them to take a similar approach than the one you took.
Okay. Now, actually, what has happened in Sri Lanka as the central bank, it was not an isolated initiative. As I said, it originally came from the government because government had the vision in terms of moving towards sustainability. And at the same time, there are a lot of initiatives around the world in terms of the sustainable finance initiative. For example, for emerging countries, Sustainable Banking Network of International Finance Corporation. And in the European region, you have these NFGs. Likewise, there are a lot of regional initiatives. So I think one initial step would be partnering with some international agencies like IFC for emerging countries, and they are basically helping in terms of technical assistance. And also in our case, in addition to technical assistance, we approach some of the international institutions like UNDP, Biofin for financing. And the first thing, even before that, I think the central bank should have the willingness to do so, because central banks, they have to realize that sustainability is one of the key things in their mandate, because traditionally they are basically mandated for these monetary policy and financial system stability. But both these aspects or objectives are affected by sustainability issues. So the central bank should realize that they have a real role to play. So in that sense, again, the government, because most of the central banks are working in harmony with the government, so the government policy should be basically in terms of sustainability. So I think that should be the way.
Thank you so much. And so last question before we close this webinar. And so this one will be directed towards Gilles, who was extremely active in the chat. So thanks a lot again to answering to a lot of questions. This is basically trying to put together 2 or 3 questions that were asked. One main one was how could we actually protect the SMEs using the support from the development banks, since this was also something that was brought by Philippe Zawati, the importance to scale up and to have this incubation and basically starting to increase the small companies, and bringing into this also if the AFD is going to in the next decade try to prioritize nature-based solution rather than gray infrastructure, for example. So yeah, if you could gives us a little more information on those 2. You're muted, Jill.
Sorry, thanks. We have a clear strategy to promote nature-based solutions, and we have agreed, especially with regards to the convergence between climate finance and biodiversity finance, to make sure that by 2025, 1/3 of all climate co-benefits are achieved with finance that have a positive biodiversity co-benefit as well. So we have engaged in really promoting nature-based solutions for climate, but as well in other sectors such as water sanitation, such as land use planning, such as coastal management, etc. I think I want to answer maybe globally a question on how to bring further together public money and private money in favor of biodiversity. And we're all very familiar with the high potentials of blending and of de-risking by public money, and of having a specific role for public money in impact investment instruments. Especially to take responsibility on the junior tranches, on the most risky part, and I think I want to be maybe a bit political here, but we have all seen, in Davos and in the reports, 1,400 billion dividends have been paid to shareholders in private companies this year. we are looking at a budget to save biodiversity that's almost 3 times smaller than that, even if we're generous, like 400 or 500 billion per year. So I do think when we start talking about blending and about bringing public and private money, we need to talk about the share and the responsibility of profit in value chains. Because as soon as you use tax money's payer in such blended sort of instruments that are indeed very, very powerful to attract finance, private finance to biodiversity, there's a question of whose responsibility is it, to make that little improvement of biodiversity mainstreaming. Is it the private sector and their externalities? Is it, the market? Is it the public sector? There's a key question that needs to be raised there and that hasn't yet been addressed fully. And I think this is one of the very strong conditions to further, bring together public money and private money for larger impacts.
Thank you so much, Gilles. I think this is those are really, really inspirational comments, and I hope all participants are going to go back after these webinars with this in their mind and see what everybody can do. So last questions, because we will need to close, and this is for actually GCash, so for Mabel. So you were talking about partners and the fact that a lot of people were wanting to join you, and we also spoke about this incubation and the fact that we needed to make the good companies, the ones that are having good impact, to grow and scale up. So if you could give a little more maybe information on this type of partnerships that exist and what you're looking for.
Actually, the app is only available in the Philippines, but we are trying to convince Ant Forest, our partner in China, to actually look into the idea of sharing it with other countries as well. So what's happening in the Philippines is that we, as I mentioned earlier, we identify like-minded companies who would like to help us, or who would really like to make a difference in the environment. So we want to work, we work with them, and so we could have like co-funding initiatives that we could have to make this campaign work better. And hopefully, if we could also get the support of international organizations such as USAID, UNDP, NORAD, or whoever it is that we could really tap to aid the Philippines in this initiative, because it's not only going to support the forests, but also biodiversity as well. So we look forward to identifying these potential partners internationally as well.
Thank you so much, Mabel.
Yeah.
So this is all from our side, because we will need to close this webinar. You can post your questions on the LinkedIn group if some of were not answers, and back to you, Ono.
Well, thank you so much for staying with us a little longer and for your very active participation. I think it's been really interesting because we've been able to go a bit more into depth on who is part of this finance and private sector and what they're doing. And from what I've seen, we have quite a few rising stars out there, which is very promising. It's a sign of hope. So we need to make sure that the stars are aligned. And I think there's a lot that every country can do to be a catalyzer for private and finance sectors interventions. I think a few things that have been mentioned throughout, I think there was a very clear message of needing more partnerships, and we've seen those partnerships emerging, but we need to do more. And another important message that has come across is that we have to work on scaling up. I think the framing from Mirova at the beginning was very efficient to look at the whole spectrum from incubation to scaling up, and especially on scaling up, there lies a big challenge. So I hope that these are some of the elements that countries keep in mind for their national strategies and also for the global biodiversity framework. And that's something we're gonna hear about a little bit more if you stay with us for the last and final session of this virtual series, session 6. And I'm just going to ask my colleague to put some more information about this session, which will be at 3 o'clock Paris time, so in a few hours from now. And I hope you're going to be all with us for this final session, where we're going to look more at the future. What should we do in the next decade? How can we indeed scale up all these initiatives? How can we bring the private sector to the core of the biodiversity agenda? And maybe in 10 years from now, we look back and say, hey, wait a minute, that was a major transformational change that we went through with all those different actors. So that's my hope. And for now, I thank you all for participating, and thank very much the speakers for all of your time. And it was a series of very interesting interventions. Thank you all for your questions, which we're going to continue on our LinkedIn platform. So that's it from my side, and I hope to speak to you in a few hours from now. Bye for now.